In A Blizzard's Grip, a wounded dog's desperate plea pulls Lila Harper into a thrilling, heart-wrenching mystery. Welcome to Pause Verve. Enjoy the story. Like and share with others. Lila Harper stood motionless on the weathered porch of her late grandfather's mountain cabin, her scarred knuckles whitening as she gripped the splintered railing, the sharp bite of the Pinehurst winter air cutting through her worn flannel jacket, a relic from her army days that still smelled faintly of desert dust and gun oil. 10 years as an army ranger, 2 grueling tours in Afghanistan, and a medical discharge after a roadside bomb tore through her convoy had driven her to this remote sanctuary, a place where the silence was supposed to stitch together the pieces of her shattered spirit, where the endless sea of pines stretching beyond the cabin's clearing could swallow the memories she couldn't escape. The bomb had taken 5 of her squad, leaving her with a jagged scar snaking along her jawline, and a mind that replayed the explosion in vivid, unrelenting nightmares, flashes of fire, the screams of her soldiers, the acrid stench of burning, metal that woke her gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding against the cabin's log walls, the only witness to her private war. She'd chosen this isolation deliberately, fleeing the well-meaning but suffocating questions from civilians who could never understand the weight of what she carried, their eyes full of pity that felt like salt in her wounds. Her grandfather's cabin, inherited after his quiet passing a year ago, was her fortress, a place to wrestle her demons alone. Its creaking floors and frost-laced windows, a stark contrast to the chaos of war zones she'd left behind. Yet, even in this solitude, the wind seemed to whisper memories she couldn't outrun, each gust through the pines carrying echoes of orders shouted over gunfire, of laughter shared in dusty tents, of promises to her squad she hadn't kept. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she turned her gaze to the horizon, where the mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their snow-capped peaks indifferent to her pain. And she wondered if healing was even possible, or if she was destined to be a ghost in her own life, haunting this cabin with her regrets. She'd arrived 3 weeks ago, unpacking only the essentials: a duffel bag of clothes, a worn copy of her grandfather's favorite book, and the hunting rifle she kept locked in its case, a reminder of the discipline that had once anchored her. The cabin was sparse but functional, its stone fireplace the heart of the small space, where she spent evenings staring into the flames, trying to burn away the guilt that clung to her like a second skin. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the lawyer who'd handed her the deed, her phone left off, her satellite radio unplugged, the world beyond the pines a distant hum she wasn't ready to face. Lila's days blended into a rhythm of survival, chopping wood, boiling water, checking the perimeter like she was still on patrol, her military instincts refusing to fade even in this peaceful wilderness. But peace was elusive, the quiet heavier than she'd expected, pressing against her chest like an unspoken grief, amplifying the loneliness she'd thought she wanted. She'd come here to hide, to nurse her wounds in private, but the solitude was a double-edged sword, offering safety yet sharpening her sense of disconnection, as if she were drifting further from the person she'd once been, the captain who'd led with courage, who'd believed in the mission, in her team, in herself. Now that version of Lila felt like a stranger, replaced by someone who flinched at sudden sounds, who woke each night clutching the knife she kept under her pillow, who avoided mirrors to escape the hollow eyes staring back. The scar on her jaw, a cruel map of that final mission, was a constant reminder of her failure, of the soldiers she couldn't save, their names etched in her mind like a litany of loss: Ramirez, Chen, O'Malley, Patel, Dawson. She whispered their names sometimes, a ritual to keep them alive, to honor them, even as it tore her apart, each syllable a weight that anchored her to the past, to the moment she'd lost everything. The cabin's isolation was supposed to be her salvation, but it was also a mirror reflecting her brokenness back at her, forcing her to confront the truth she'd been running from. Survival wasn't the same as living. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purples, Lila stepped back inside, the cold following her like a shadow, the fire in the hearth casting flickering patterns across the room, warming her hands but not her heart. She sank into the armchair, by the window, her grandfather's old wool blanket draped over her shoulders, its faint scent of cedar a fragile link to a man who'd loved these mountains, who'd told her stories of their magic as a child, stories she'd forgotten until now, tales of hidden paths and unexpected allies in the wilderness. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful song that seemed to call her name, and she closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, knowing it would bring the nightmares instead, unaware that a blizzard was gathering strength, carrying with it a wounded messenger whose desperate scratches would soon pierce her solitude, promising a mystery that would change her forever. Lila Harper sat rigid in the armchair, the fire's glow barely holding back the darkness that pressed against the cabin's windows, her fingers tracing the edge of the knife she kept tucked beside her, a habit from years of sleeping with one eye open in war zones where danger never slept. The blizzard outside roared with unrelenting fury, wind rattling the shutters, snow piling against the door, isolating her even further in this mountain refuge where she'd sought to escape her past. 3 weeks in Pinarest, and the solitude she'd craved was both a balm and a burden, the silence amplifying her thoughts, memories of her squad's laughter, the bomb's deafening roar, the guilt that clung to her like frost. She'd been dozing fitfully, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, when a faint sound broke through the storm's howl, a desperate scratching at the cabin door, so weak it might have been the wind, but persistent enough to snap her to attention. Her pulse quickened, instincts honed by combat flooding back, and she rose silently, knife in hand, her scarred jaw tightening as she moved toward the door, every sense alert for threat. Lila hadn't expected company, hadn't wanted it. Her only visitors the ghosts in her dreams, and the idea of an intruder in this remote wilderness set her nerves on edge, her mind flashing to threats she'd faced, ambushes, betrayals, the chaos of war. She paused, listening, the scratching growing fainter, sporadic, as if whatever was out there was losing strength, and something in that faltering sound stirred a flicker of unease, not fear, but a pull she couldn't name. A whisper of connection that pierced her carefully built walls. Flipping on the porch light, she cracked the door, knife poised, the cold air rushing in like a slap, and what she saw stopped her breath. A Malamute collapsed in the snow, its grey fur matted with blood and ice, a crimson pool spreading beneath it, staining the pristine white. The dog raised its head weakly, revealing piercing green eyes that seemed to cut through the walls Lila had built around her heart, eyes that held pain, but also a quiet plea, as if it had fought through the storm. To find her specifically, its gaze locking onto hers with a trust that felt almost human. She scanned the clearing, rifle now in hand, searching for signs of pursuit, human or animal. But the blizzard had erased all tracks, leaving only this wounded creature at her threshold, its shallow breaths a fragile thread in the freezing air. Lila hesitated, her instinct to retreat warring with the sight before her, the dog's trembling body and those eyes stirring memories of soldiers she'd triaged, of lives she'd fought to save, of moments where action meant everything. She whispered, "Hey there," her voice rough from disuse, rusty like an old gate, and the dog whimpered, trying to stand before collapsing again, its effort piercing something in Lila she'd thought long buried, a spark of compassion she'd locked away with her medals and memories. The Malamute's collar, worn and caked with frost, bore a metal tag etched with a single word, Shadow. And that name, coupled with those green eyes, felt like a call she couldn't ignore, a summons from a world she'd tried to shut out. Stirring a warmth she hadn't felt since her squad's camaraderie, she knelt beside the dog, her breath visible in the porch light, and for a moment she was back in Afghanistan, stabilizing a wounded comrade, her hands steady despite the chaos, her mind locking onto the task of saving what could be saved. Shadow's gaze never left her, and in that moment Lila felt a connection, fragile but undeniable, as if this animal saw the parts of her she hid from herself, the soldier, the survivor, the woman who still wanted to believe she could make a difference. She pushed the door wider, decision made, and carefully lifted Shadow, surprised by how light the large dog felt, its body limp yet warm against her chest, as if it had finally surrendered its strength to her care. Stepping inside, she kicked the door shut against the storm, the firelight casting their shadows on the walls, and as she laid Shadow on a blanket by the hearth, she realized her solitude had been irrevocably breached, not by force, but by a pair of green eyes that seemed to know her better than she knew herself, promising a mystery that would unravel her carefully guarded world. Lila Harper knelt beside the injured Malamute, the cabin's firelight flickering across shadows blood-matted. Her hands moving with the practiced precision of a combat medic as she assessed the damage. The storm's howl outside fading to a distant hum, while her focus narrowed to the life trembling beneath her fingers. Her heart pounding not from fear, but from a rekindled purpose that felt both foreign and vital. Shadow lay still, his green eyes tracking her every move, calm despite the pain, as if he understood she was his lifeline, his trust stirring a warmth in Lila's chest she hadn't felt since her squad days, when saving a life meant defying the chaos of war, a fleeting victory against the losses that haunted her. She'd carried the dog to the kitchen table, clearing it with a sweep of her arm, and spread clean towels beneath him, her grandfather's old first aid kit open beside her, its contents a familiar arsenal: gauze, antiseptic, sutures, antibiotics, tools. She hadn't touched since Afghanistan, but wielded now with steady hands, each motion a reclaiming of the soldier she'd been before the bomb stole her squad and left her with a scarred jaw and a fractured soul. The cabin's warmth enveloped them, the fire crackling as Lila gently parted Shadow's fur, revealing deep puncture wounds along his flank, likely from a wolf or cougar, the kind of marks nature leaves in its brutal indifference, their raw edges a testament to his fight to survive. But as she cleaned the blood away, her breath caught, her jaw tightening at the sight of other injuries, straight, deliberate cuts, too precise for claws, and faint burn marks that spoke of human cruelty, not animal instinct. Each one a calculated act of violence that made her stomach churn with a quiet fury. Her mind flashed to missions where she'd seen such wounds, not on animals but on prisoners, and the realization hit her like a punch. Someone had tortured this dog, had taken pleasure in its pain, and the thought ignited a protective instinct she hadn't known she still possessed, a vow forming in her chest to shield Shadow from whoever had done this. She murmured, "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Her voice soft, meant for Shadow but also for herself, acknowledging the scars they both carried, his visible, hers buried beneath layers of guilt and grief, the names of her lost squad: Ramirez, Chen, O'Malley, Patel, Dawson, echoing in her mind as she worked. The dog's ears twitched at his name, etched on the collar she'd carefully cleaned, and Lila felt a pang of connection, as if Shadow's survival mirrored her own. Both of them battered but still fighting, their shared resilience a fragile bridge in the cabin's quiet. She worked methodically, irrigating the wounds with saline from her kit, applying antiseptic, stitching where needed, her hands remembering the rhythm of emergency care, each suture a small defiance against the violence done to this creature. Her focus absolute, pushing back the nightmares that usually crept in during still moments. Shadow barely flinched, his trust unwavering, his green eyes holding hers in a gaze that felt almost human, as if he knew the weight of her past and chose to lean into her strength anyway, his calm surrender a gift that steadied her trembling soul. The puncture wounds were bad but treatable, the antibiotics in her kit enough to stave off infection, but the cuts and burns told a darker story, one Lila couldn't fully unravel yet, though her mind raced with questions. Who would do this? Why and what had Shadow been running from in that blizzard to find her door? She bandaged the worst of the wounds, her fingers lingering on his fur, and for the first time in months her hands didn't tremble, her focus a lifeline that tethered her to the present. The act of saving Shadow a rebellion against the despair that had driven her to Pinarest. Lila stepped back, wiping her brow, and studied Shadow, now resting on the towels, his breathing steadier, his eyes half closed but still watchful, as if he refused to let her out of his sight, his trust a weight she both cherished and feared, knowing it bound her to a mystery she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She brought a bowl of water and softened some jerky and warm broth, the only food she had suitable, and Shadow lapped at it cautiously, his strength returning in small measures, each sip a victory that warmed her heart, a reminder of why she'd fought so hard in the field. Moving him to a makeshift bed of blankets by the fire, Lila sank into the armchair, her own exhaustion creeping in, but she couldn't look away from the dog, his presence filling the cabin with a purpose she hadn't felt since her discharge, a spark of life in a heart she'd thought too broken to feel again. "Whoever did this to you," she whispered, "they won't touch you again." the promise slipping out before she could stop it, a vow to Shadow and perhaps to herself, a reclaiming of the protector she'd once been, the captain who'd led her squad through fire, who'd believed she could save them all until the bomb proved her wrong. As the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, Lila realized she was no longer alone, not just in the cabin but in her fight to heal, Shadow's arrival a crack in the armor she'd built, letting in a sliver of hope she wasn't ready to name yet couldn't deny, his green eyes a beacon in the storm, promising answers to questions she hadn't yet dared to ask. Lila Harper sat by the cabin's hearth, the fire's warm glow casting soft shadows across the room, her eyes fixed on Shadow, the Malamute now resting on a nest of blankets, his bandaged wounds a stark reminder of the cruelty he'd endured. Yet his green eyes held a quiet resilience that tugged at the edges of her guarded heart. 2 days had passed since she'd found him bleeding in the snow, and the blizzard outside still raged, sealing them in a cocoon of isolation where time seemed to blur, each hour marked by the crackle of the fire and Shadow's slow recovery. Lila had tended to him diligently, changing his bandages, coaxing him to eat small meals of softened jerky and broth, her combat medic skills a lifeline for the dog whose trust in her grew with every gentle touch. She'd spoken to him softly, her voice a rusty tool she hadn't used in weeks, sharing fragments of her thoughts about the mountains, her grandfather's stories, the weight of her nightmares, surprised by how natural it felt to confide in a creature who couldn't answer, but listened with an intensity that felt almost human. Shadow's strength returned gradually, his trembling limbs steadying, his wounds beginning to heal under her care, and Lila found herself marveling at his will to survive, a mirror to her own stubborn persistence despite the scars they both carried. Yet as the storm howled on, Shadow's behavior shifted, growing increasingly restless, his calm demeanor giving way to an urgent fixation on the cabin's lone window facing the dense forest beyond the clearing. He'd rise from his blankets, limping to the glass, pouring at it with a soft whine, his green eyes scanning the snow-draped pines as if searching for something, or someone, lost in the blizzard's fury. At first Lila dismissed it as instinct, a dog's reaction to the storm's chaos, but the pattern persisted, Shadow returning to the window every few hours, his whines sharper, his paws more insistent, as if trying to communicate a message she couldn't decipher. She'd kneel beside him, stroking his fur, murmuring, "What is it, boy?" Her voice gentle but tinged with unease, the dog's agitation stirring a flicker of curiosity in her, a pull toward the unknown that clashed with her desire to stay walled, off from the world. His tail would thump weakly when she approached, a gesture of trust that warmed her, but his focus remained on the forest, his body tense, ears twitching at sounds she couldn't hear, as if the storm held secrets he alone understood. Lila's military instincts kicked in, her mind analyzing Shadow's behavior like a tactical puzzle. Was he sensing a threat, a predator, or something else entirely? The cuts and burns on his body, clearly inflicted by human hands, suggested he'd escaped something sinister, and the thought gnawed at her, raising questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. She'd come to the cabin to avoid complications, to heal in solitude, yet Shadow's presence was unraveling that plan, his quiet insistence drawing her toward a mystery she felt compelled to solve. By the second evening, as the storm showed no sign of easing, Shadow's urgency intensified, his whines turning to soft barks, restrained but deliberate as he stood at the window, claws scratching the frame, his gaze locked on the dark forest. Lila sat watching him, her rifle leaning against the wall, her knife within reach, the weight of her past urging her to stay put, to let the storm bury whatever Shadow was chasing. But those green eyes, so full of purpose, seemed to see through her defenses, reminding her of the soldiers she'd led, their determination in the face of impossible odds, and she felt a stir of something she'd thought lost. Duty, not to a mission, but to this creature who'd chosen her. She rose, crossing to the window, peering into the swirling snow, seeing nothing but white and shadow, yet trusting Shadow's instincts more than her own doubts. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" she said, her hand resting on his head, feeling the tension in his body, the unspoken plea that whatever he'd fled from was still out there waiting. The cabin, once her fortress, felt suddenly small, its walls no longer a barrier but a cage, and Lila realized that Shadow's arrival had changed more than her routine. It had awakened a part of her that still wanted to fight, to protect, to make things right. As night deepened, she made a decision, not yet voiced but forming in her mind, to follow Shadow's lead, to step into the storm and face whatever he was running from, a choice that would bind their fates and pull her from the isolation she'd clung to. Lila Harper stood by the cabin's frost-laced window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Shadow paw at the frame, his green eyes fixed on the blizzard-swept forest, his soft whines carrying an urgency that had grown impossible to ignore. Over the past 2 days, pulling her from the cocoon of solitude she'd built to shield her wounded spirit, the Malamute's relentless focus on the pines beyond the clearing, his body tense with purpose despite his healing wounds, had stirred something in Lila, a mix of curiosity, duty, and a faint dread that whatever Shadow had escaped was still out there, waiting in the storm's heart. She'd come to her grandfather's cabin to hide from the world, to nurse the scars of her Army Ranger days, the nightmares of a bomb that stole her squad, the guilt that clung to her like frost. But Shadow's arrival had cracked that isolation, his trust in her awakening a part of her she'd thought dead, the protector, the soldier who acted when others faltered. Now, as dawn broke on the 3rd day, the storm easing just enough to reveal the forest's dark silhouette, Lila made a choice she couldn't fully explain, driven by the dog's unwavering determination and the unspoken bond forming between them. She knelt beside Shadow, her hand resting on his fur, feeling the strength returning to his frame, and murmured, "All right, boy, we're doing this your way." Her voice steady despite the uncertainty curling in her gut, a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. Lila moved with purpose, her military training taking over, gathering supplies with the efficiency of countless missions, her backpack stuffed with a first aid kit, protein bars, water, a flashlight, matches in a waterproof case, and a thermal blanket for emergencies. She layered herself in thermal gear, waterproof pants, and insulated boots, each item a reminder of patrols in hostile terrain, her movements precise, deliberate, as if preparing for combat rather than a trek through snow. The hunting rifle came next, unlocked from its case, checked methodically, its weight familiar in her hands, a precaution against whatever had left those cruel cuts on Shadow's body, human or otherwise. She strapped her knife to her belt, its presence a quiet reassurance, and glanced at Shadow, who stood by the door, his posture alert, tail wagging once as if approving her readiness. "You sure about this?" she asked, half expecting an answer, and Shadow barked softly, his green eyes meeting hers with a clarity that silenced her doubts, as if he knew exactly where they needed to go and why. Lila opened the door, the cold rushing in like a living thing, and Shadow stepped out without hesitation, his paws sinking into the fresh snow as he headed toward the tree line, pausing to ensure she followed, his purpose unwavering despite the limp in his gait. She secured the cabin, her breath visible in the frigid air, and muttered, "I must be crazy," to herself, the words swallowed by the wind as she trailed the dog into the silent, snow-draped forest, leaving the safety of her refuge behind. The pines closed around them, their branches heavy with snow dampening sound until the world felt hushed. Each crunch of Lila's boots and Shadow's lighter footfalls, the only proof they existed in this frozen wilderness. Her training kept, her vigilant, mentally marking their path. 3 pines in a cluster, a boulder half buried in snow, her senses heightened, scanning for threats, her rifle slung over her shoulder, but ready. Shadow moved with surprising speed, his nose occasionally dipping to the snow, then lifting as if following an invisible trail, his determination pulling Lila forward, even as her mind wrestled with the recklessness of this journey. She'd come, to Pinerest to avoid connections, to heal alone, yet here she was, following a wounded dog into a storm because his eyes held the same resolve she'd seen in her soldiers, the kind that pushed through pain to finish the mission. An hour in, the forest grew denser, the light dimming as clouds thickened overhead, and Lila's legs burned from trudging through knee-deep snow. But Shadow showed no sign of slowing, his focus absolute, his occasional glance back a silent encouragement to keep pace. She adjusted her pack, her breath steadying into a rhythm, the physical exertion grounding her, pushing back the memories that usually crept in during quiet moments, the explosion, the screams, the faces she couldn't save. Shadow's presence anchored her, his purpose giving her own a shape, and for the first time in months she felt alive, not just surviving but moving towards something, even if she didn't know what. As they crested a small rise, Lila spotted faint marks on a tree. 3 scratches, too uniform for nature, and her pulse quickened, her hand brushing the rifle strap as she approached, tracing the lines with gloved fingers, confirming they were man-made. A trail marker hinting at a deliberate path through this wild place. Shadow barked softly, as if affirming her discovery, then continued, leading her deeper, and Lila's unease grew, tempered by a growing trust in the dog who'd chosen her, whose wounds told a story she was now part of. The cold bit at her exposed skin, but she pressed on. Shadow's green eyes a beacon in the snow, guiding her toward a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face, yet couldn't turn away from. Lila Harper trudged through the snow-draped forest, her boots sinking with each step as she followed Shadow. The Malamute's determined pace unwavering despite his healing wounds, his green eyes fixed on an unseen destination deep within the Boer pines, pulling her further from the safety of her grandfather's cabin and into a mystery that felt both perilous and inevitable. The blizzard had eased to a steady snowfall, but the cold was relentless, seeping through her thermal layers. Yet Lila's focus remained sharp, her military training keeping her alert as she marked their path. 5 pines in a row, a frozen stream barely visible under ice, her rifle a reassuring weight across her back. Shadow moved with purpose, pausing only to sniff the air or glance back, ensuring she kept up, his trust in her a silent anchor that steadied her against the doubts whispering in her mind. What was she chasing? Why had she left her solitude for? Her dog's desperate plea, and what lay at the end of this trail marked by those eerie man-made scratches on the trees. 2 hours into their trek, the forest thickened, branches knitting overhead to dim the light, and Lila's legs ached, her breath fogging in rhythmic bursts, but Shadow's urgency drove her forward, his limping gait a testament to his resolve, mirroring the stubborn will that had carried her through war zones and now through this frozen wilderness. She'd spotted another set of tree markings 20 yards back, confirming a deliberate path, and the realization tightened her grip on the rifle strap, her instincts screaming that Shadow's wounds, those cruel cuts and burns, were tied to whoever had carved this trail, a human hand that had no place in this wild place. As they crested a ridge, Lila's breath caught at the sight of thin smoke curling above the treetops, faint but unmistakable, a sign of life in this desolate stretch, and Shadow's tail wagged for the first time, his pace quickening toward the source, his body tense with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She followed cautiously, her hand resting on the rifle, her heart pounding not from exertion but from the weight of what she might find, the forest's silence now heavy with secrets. The trees parted to reveal a small clearing, and there, half buried, in snow and overgrowth, stood a dilapidated shack, its weathered boards sagging, one window boarded shut, the smoke rising from a crumbling chimney, the only hint it wasn't abandoned. Shadow whined softly, pressing against her leg, his eyes locked on the shack, and Lila crouched beside him, whispering, "You know this place, don't you?" Her voice low, her tactical mind scanning the clearing. No footprints, no signs of recent activity. The snow a blank canvas hiding whatever had drawn Shadow here. She approached slowly, Shadow leading with deliberate steps, his ears forward, tail low, and as they circled to the front, Lila's blood ran cold at the sight of a heavy chain wrapped around the door handles, secured with a rusted padlock, not to keep intruders out, but to trap someone inside. Shadow barked sharply, scratching at the door, his urgency now a desperate plea, and Lila's heart raced, realization dawning that this was no ordinary shack but a prison, and Shadow had led her here to free its captive. She knelt by the lock, her multi-tool already in hand, her training kicking in as she worked to break it, her eyes darting to the tree line for any sign of threat, the quiet of the clearing unnerving after Shadow's agitation. The lock gave way, with a soft click, and she unwound the chain, letting it fall silently to the snow. Shadow pushing forward, his nose against the door seam, urging her to act. Lila drew her knife, pushed the door open, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges, and stepped into the dim interior, the air stale and cold despite the faint embers in a small fireplace, carrying the scent of neglect and something sharper, illness. Shadow moved confidently past her, heading for a back door, and Lila followed, her rifle now in hand, every sense heightened as she called softly, "Hello, anyone here?" Her voice swallowed by the shack's oppressive silence. The main room was sparse. A rickety table, a single chair, a shelf with scant supplies, but Shadow ignored it, whining at the back door which hung ajar, and Lila pushed it open, revealing a dark bedroom, a single window covered by a tattered blanket. In the faint light, she saw a figure on a narrow bed, motionless under threadbare blankets, and Shadow rushed forward, nuzzling the figure with a soft whimper, his devotion clear. Lila pulled the blanket from the window, letting grey light flood in, and gasped at the sight of an elderly woman, her face gaunt, hair white and tangled, her left wrist handcuffed to the bed frame, the skin beneath raw and scabbed from futile struggles. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Lila said, setting down her rifle to check for a pulse, finding it weak, irregular, the woman's skin ice-cold, signs of severe hypothermia and dehydration, conditions Lila had treated in the field, but never in a place like this. Shadow licked the woman's face gently, his distress palpable, and Lila's mind raced. This woman, clearly Shadow's owner, had been imprisoned here, and the dog's injuries now made horrific sense. His escape a desperate bid to find help. She found a key on a nail by the door, unlocking the handcuff after several tries, the woman stirring faintly, whispering a name. Esther. Her voice cracked, barely audible, but enough to confirm her identity. Lila's combat medic training took over, wrapping the woman in the thermal blanket from her pack, assessing her condition, knowing they needed to move fast, but unsure how in this remote place with the storm still lingering. Shadow stayed close, his green eyes shifting between Esther and Lila, as if willing her to save the woman he'd risked everything to protect, and Lila felt the weight of his trust, a responsibility that both grounded and terrified her. She'd followed Shadow on faith, and now faced with this hidden truth, a woman chained, a dog tortured, a shack that reeked of cruelty, Lila knew there was no turning back, her solitude shattered by a purpose she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. Lila Harper crouched beside Esther in the dim shack, her hands steady as she adjusted the thermal blanket around the frail woman, Shadow's green eyes watching her every move, his soft whines a constant reminder of the urgency binding them in. This frozen prison, the faint warmth from the dying fire doing little to counter the chill seeping through the walls. Esther's pulse was weak, her breathing shallow, and Lila's combat medic training screamed that time was slipping away, hypothermia and malnutrition threatening to claim the woman Shadow had risked everything to save. But the chained door and the dog's tortured wounds pointed to a danger still lurking, one Lila's instincts told her was closer than the forest's edge. She'd just begun searching the shack for supplies, water, food, anything to stabilize Esther, when Shadow's head snapped toward the front door, his hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in his throat, the first sign of aggression from the gentle Malamute, and Lila froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped nearby, her heart pounding as she strained to hear over the wind's fading howl. The crunch of boots in the snow outside confirmed her fear, deliberate steps approaching the shack, and Shadow's growl deepened, his body tensing as he positioned himself between Esther and the door. His loyalty a shield Lila couldn't help but admire. She rose silently, rifle in hand, moving to the side of the entrance, her training kicking in. Control the space, assess the threat, protect the vulnerable, her mind racing with the certainty that whoever had chained Esther and hurt Shadow was coming back, and she was all that stood between them and harm. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of cold air, and a man stepped inside. His expensive winter gear dusted with snow, a small pack slung over his shoulder, his bearded face flushed from the cold as he stamped his boots, oblivious to the danger waiting in the shadows. Lila's grip tightened on the rifle, held at low ready as she studied him. Middle-aged, confident but not a soldier, his movements lacking the precision of someone trained for combat, yet the pistol holstered at his hip marked him as a threat. Shadow's restraint shattered, the dog lunging forward with a snarl, teeth bared. and the man stumbled back, shouting, "Shadow, how the hell?" His voice a mix of shock and recognition, confirming he was no stranger to the dog's pain. Lila stepped into view, her voice cutting through the tension. "I wouldn't move if I were you," her tone calm but laced with steel, the rifle steady as she added, "He seems to have strong opinions about you." Her words a warning as Shadow growled, poised to strike. The man froze, his eyes darting between Lila, the snarling dog, and the rifle, his initial shock giving way to a calculated facade as he demanded, "Who are you? What are you doing in my shack?" His attempt at authority, faltering under Shadow's unrelenting glare. Lila kept her gaze locked on him, noting the flicker of fear in his eyes, and countered, "Your shack that's debatable according to the woman handcuffed in there." Her nod toward the bedroom making his face tighten, a flash of guilt or calculation, crossing his features before he shifted to a mask of concern. "My mother, you found her, thank God. I've been so worried she wandered off in the storm. She's not well," he said, his voice dripping with false relief. But Lila's training had taught her to read lies, and his story crumbled under scrutiny. The handcuff on Esther's wrist a truth he couldn't spin. "Not well enough to need restraints," Lila shot back, her rifle unwavering as Shadow's growl intensified, the dog taking a step closer, forcing the man, Nathan, she assumed from Esther's faint whispers, to edge toward the door, his composure cracking. "Call off your dog," he snapped, fear breaking through, and Lila's lips curved slightly. "He's not my dog, he's hers, and he remembers what you did to him." Her words sharp, pointing to the burns and cuts on Shadow's body, evidence of Nathan's cruelty. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance surfacing. "You've got it all wrong. I'm just taking care of my mother. She's confused, dangerous to herself." But Lila pressed, "The journal in there says otherwise. It's pretty clear about what you've been doing." Her bluff hitting its mark as Nathan's face paled, the mention of a journal, real or not, unsettling him. She'd found a notebook on the table, its pages filled with Esther's shaky handwriting, detailing months of captivity, Nathan's demands for a land deed, and Lila used it now to push him, sensing his desperation. "You don't know what you're messing with," Nathan growled, dropping the act, his hand inching toward his pistol, and Lila's training took over, her voice a command, "Don't," as she raised the rifle slightly, a clear warning. But Nathan was faster than she expected, drawing the pistol, and in a heartbeat Lila surged forward, using her rifle barrel to knock his arm up, the shot firing wild into the ceiling, wood splintering as she drove her shoulder into his chest, slamming him against the doorframe. Shadow leapt, clamping his jaws around Nathan's wrist, forcing him to drop the pistol with a cry of pain, and Lila kicked it across the floor, pinning Nathan to the wall with the rifle barrel pressed horizontally against his throat, her breath steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "Shadow, enough," she ordered, and the dog released his grip, retreating to her side, hackles raised, ready to act again. "You're making a mistake," Nathan spat, blood dripping from his wrist, but Lila's voice was ice. "I don't think so. Now sit and explain why you've got your mother chained up, and what's so important you'd torture her dog for it." Her words a demand, not a request, as she gestured to the chair, keeping the rifle trained on him. Nathan glared but complied, his eyes cold with calculation, and as he sat, Lila felt the weight of the moment, her solitude replaced by a fight she hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from, Shadow's loyalty and Esther's suffering binding her to a truth she was only beginning to unravel. Lila Harper stood in the shack's dim interior, her rifle trained on Nathan, his wrists now bound with zip ties from her pack, his defiant glare meeting her steady gaze as Shadow growled softly at her side, the Malamute's green eyes locked. On the man who'd tortured him and imprisoned Esther, the air thick with tension and the acrid scent of smoke from the fireplace's dying embers. Esther lay in the back room, her frail form wrapped in Lila's thermal blanket, her pulse dangerously weak, hypothermia and malnutrition pushing her to the edge, and Lila's combat medic training told her they had hours, maybe less, to get her to safety, but the shack's isolation and the lingering storm outside trapped them in a race against time. Nathan's pistol lay kicked into a corner, his earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. But Lila knew he was still a threat, his eyes darting to the door, calculating, while Shadow's presence kept him in check, the dog's loyalty a shield for Esther and a reminder of why Lila couldn't falter. She'd demanded answers, and Nathan's grudging confession revealed a chilling motive. A family land deed hidden by Esther, tied to a valley rich with untapped minerals worth millions, his greed driving him to chain his mother and brutalize her dog to force her compliance. Lila's mind raced, piecing together the stakes. Esther's journal found on the table chronicled months of coercion, Nathan's threats escalating as she refused to reveal the deed's location, her love. Foreshadow her only solace until he'd escaped, seeking help. Lila glanced at the bedroom door, her heart heavy with the weight of Esther's suffering. Shadow's wounds now a map of his desperate journey to find her, and she felt a surge of resolve, a soldier's clarity cutting through the chaos, knowing she had to act fast to save the woman and honor the dog's trust. As she checked Nathan's restraints, a spark from the fireplace caught her eye, a stray ember landing on a pile of dry rags near the table, and before she could react, flames licked upward, feeding on the shack's aged wood, the fire spreading with terrifying speed, turning the air thick with smoke. "Damn it," Lila muttered, her training kicking in as she grabbed her pack, slinging the rifle over her shoulder, and rushed to the bedroom, Shadow already at Esther's side, whining urgently as the flames crept closer, the shack's walls crackling under the heat. She lifted Esther, the woman's weight alarmingly light, wrapping her tightly in the blanket, and called, "Shadow door," the dog bolting toward the exit, his instincts aligned with hers as she navigated the smoke-filled room. The fire now engulfing the main area, blocking the front door. Nathan shouted, "Help me, you can't leave me here." His voice panicked as he struggled against the zip ties, and Lila hesitated, her moral code clashing with his crimes, but she couldn't abandon him to burn, even if he deserved it. She grabbed a knife from her belt, slicing his restraints with a warning, "Move now or you're on your own," and Nathan stumbled to his feet, coughing, following her as she carried Esther toward a side window, the only clear exit. Shadow pawed at the glass and Lila kicked it out, the cold air rushing in, a lifeline as she carefully passed Esther through, then climbed out, Nathan scrambling behind, the shack now a roaring inferno, collapsing in on itself as they staggered into the snow. Lila laid Esther in a sheltered spot, checking her pulse, fainter now, her lips blue, and turned to Shadow, who'd led them to a nearby cave, its entrance partially hidden by pines, a natural refuge from the storm's remnants. She carried Esther inside, Shadow guiding the way, his green eyes glowing in the dim light, and set her on the cave floor, using her pack to elevate her legs, the thermal blanket and her own jacket, the only barriers against the freezing stone. Nathan, shivering and burned on one arm, tried to follow, but Lila pointed the rifle. "Stay out there, you're not coming near her," her voice unyielding, and he sank into the snow, too weak to argue, his fate secondary to Esther's survival. The cave offered shelter, but the cold was merciless and Lila's supplies were limited. A few protein bars, a half-empty water bottle, the flashlight's beam flickering as she checked Esther's condition, her medic skills stretched thin. Without proper equipment, Shadow curled beside Esther, his body heat a small but vital warmth, and Lila whispered, "Good boy, keep her warm." Her hand brushing his fur, grateful for his presence, his courage a beacon in this desperate moment. She activated her emergency beacon, a habit from her military days. Its signal a faint hope in the storm's aftermath, but help could be hours away, and Esther's breathing grew shallower, each rasp a countdown Lila couldn't ignore. She rationed the water, dripping it into Esther's mouth, and chewed a protein bar to a paste, hoping to get some nutrients into her, but the woman's eyes remained closed, her whispered "Shadow" the only sign she was still fighting. Lila's mind churned with plans, stay and wait for rescue, risk moving Esther through the snow, or leave to find help. But each option carried deadly risks, the forest's vastness a maze that could swallow them. Shadow's gaze met hers, steady, trusting, and she drew strength from it, remembering missions where hope was all that kept her squad alive, and she vowed to keep Esther breathing until help arrived, no matter the cost. Outside, Nathan's groans faded, his burns painful but not fatal, and Lila tied him to a tree with paracord from her pack, ensuring he couldn't interfere, his greed no match for the bond between her, Shadow, and Esther. The cave's darkness pressed in, but Shadow's warmth and Esther's faint pulse tethered Lila to the moment, her solitude replaced by a purpose that burned brighter than the shack's flames, a fight for life she hadn't known she still had in her. Lila Harper huddled in the cave's frigid darkness, her body pressed close to Esther's to share warmth. Shadow curled tightly against the elderly woman's side, his green eyes glinting in the flashlight's fading beam, his steady breathing, a quiet anchor as Lila fought to keep Esther alive. Her combat medic skills stretched to their limit, with only a thermal blanket and dwindling supplies to combat the hypothermia, threatening to steal the life Shadow had risked everything to save. The shack's fire had died to embers in the distance, its collapse leaving a charred scar in the clearing. And Nathan, tied to a tree outside, shivered in silence, his burns and defeat rendering him a secondary concern as Lila focused on Esther's. Shallow breaths, each one a fragile thread she refused to let snap. The emergency beacon she'd activated before leaving her cabin pulsed silently in her pack. A faint hope in the vast wilderness, but the storm's remnants and the forest's isolation made rescue uncertain, and Lila's mind raced with calculations. How long Esther could hold on, how much water remained, whether the cave's shelter would be enough against the dropping temperature. She dripped the last of the water into Esther's mouth, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of responsibility. Shadow's trust in her, a lifeline that kept her grounded, his warmth against Esther, a small miracle in this desperate hour. Lila whispered, "Hang on just a little longer," her voice soft, meant for Esther but also for herself, a soldier's mantra from missions where survival hung by a thread, and Shadow's tail thumped once, as if he understood his presence, a bridge between them, a reminder of why she'd followed him into the storm. Hours crawled by, the cold seeping deeper, Esther's pulse growing fainter, and Lila's hope wavered, her nightmares creeping in, the bomb, her squad's screams, her failure to save them, but Shadow's nudge against her hand pulled her back, his green eyes steady, urging her to stay in the fight. Then faintly, a sound broke the forest's silence. Voices, human voices, calling search and rescue anyone out there, and Lila's heart leapt, relief flooding her as she scrambled to her feet, shouting, "Here, we're over here," her voice raw but carrying. Shadow bolting out of the cave, barking with a joy she hadn't heard before, leading the rescuers to them. Flashlights pierced the darkness, and 4 figures emerged. 3 in search and rescue gear, 1 in a sheriff's jacket. Their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos Lila had navigated, and she waved them toward the cave, explaining, "Elderly, woman critical hypothermia needs immediate evac." Her words clipped, military precise. The lead rescuer, a woman with a no-nonsense air, knelt beside Esther, assessing her condition while her team set up thermal blankets and an IV, their movements swift, professional. And Lila stepped back, Shadow at her side, his tail wagging, as he watched them work, his mission complete but his vigil unbroken. The sheriff's deputy approached, asking, "Captain Harper, you activated the beacon?" And Lila nodded, surprised they knew her name, then remembered the beacon's registration, explaining, "Found the dog injured, followed him here, discovered. Her imprisoned by her son, he's outside restrained." Her summary concise, pointing to Nathan, who was now being untied, his protests ignored as the deputy secured him with proper cuffs. The rescuer's radio crackled, confirming a medevac helicopter was inbound, the storm clearing just enough for a pickup, and Lila's tension eased slightly, though her eyes stayed on Esther, whose faint moans signaled she was still fighting, Shadow's warmth having bought her precious time. As the team prepared Esther for transport, the lead rescuer asked, "How'd you find her out here?" And Lila gestured to Shadow, saying, "He led me every step, knew exactly where to go," her voice catching with gratitude, the dog's intelligence undeniable, his loyalty a force that had reshaped her world. The deputy, overhearing, added, "We got reports of a fire from the Valley helicopter, spotted the blaze, your beacon helped narrow it down." And Lila realized the shack's destruction had been a beacon too, drawing help to this remote corner. Then a revelation hit, as the rescuer mentioned Esther's name, Esther Caldwell, and Lila's breath caught, the name sparking a memory from her grandfather's stories, a childhood friend who'd shared his love for these mountains, a connection Lila hadn't grasped until now. She rummaged in her pack, pulling out Esther's journal, its pages detailing the land deed Nathan coveted, and handed it to the deputy, saying, "This explains why he kept her here." It's about a mineral-rich valley her family owned. Her voice steady, but her mind reeling at the link to her grandfather. The journal mentioned a promise Esther made to him decades ago to protect the land they'd dreamed of preserving, and Lila felt a pang of wonder. Shadow's journey to her cabin suddenly seeming less like chance and more like fate, tying her to a past she'd never known. The helicopter's roar grew louder, its searchlights bathing the clearing in stark white, and the team transferred Esther to a stretcher, Shadow pacing anxiously, unwilling to leave her side, his whines sharp as strangers handled her. Lila knelt beside him, stroking his fur, saying, "She's going to be okay, boy, you did it." And the lead medic signaled they could take one more, nodding to Shadow. "He's hers right, he can come to keep her calm." And Lila agreed, lifting the dog into the helicopter, her own place secured to stay with him, knowing he needed her as much as Esther did. As they lifted off, Lila held Shadow close, his body pressed against her, his eyes fixed on Esther's stretcher, and through the window she watched the clearing shrink, the smoldering shack, Nathan being led away, the cave that had saved them, a chapter closing but a new one opening, her solitude replaced by a connection to Esther, Shadow, and a family history she was only beginning to understand. Lila Harper sat in the quiet of her grandfather's cabin, the fire crackling softly, casting warm shadows across the room where Esther now rested in a borrowed armchair, a quilt draped over her frail frame, her face still pale but alive with a spark that had been absent in the shack's cold darkness, while Shadow lay at her feet, his green eyes calm, his wounds healed, his presence a steady bridge between the two women who'd been brought together by his unwavering loyalty. 3 weeks had passed since the helicopter lifted them from the forest, Esther's life hanging by a thread, and Lila's world had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated, her quest for solitude replaced by a purpose she hadn't sought, but now embraced, the cabin no longer a fortress but a home filled with new meaning. Esther's recovery had been slow but steady, the hospital's care mending her body, pneumonia treated, malnutrition reversed, the raw marks from her handcuffs fading, while Lila visited daily, bringing books, sharing stories, and listening, as Esther spoke of her past, her voice gaining strength with each tale. Shadow had been her constant companion, permitted to stay in the hospital room, his quiet vigil a comfort to Esther and a marvel to the staff, his intelligence undeniable, his bond with both women a silent vow to protect them through their healing. Lila had given her statement to the sheriff, detailing Nathan's crimes, kidnapping, imprisonment, animal cruelty, and the land deed, authenticated as Esther's, tied to a valley rich with minerals, a legacy she'd guarded against her sons. Greed, its value now secondary to the human connection it had unearthed. Nathan remained in custody, facing a litany of charges, his desperation for wealth exposed as a hollow pursuit, while Esther, despite her ordeal, expressed sorrow for him, her compassion humbling Lila, who'd seen too much of war's hardness to expect such grace. The revelation that Esther had been her grandfather's childhood friend, their shared dream of preserving the valley, etched in the journal, had shaken Lila, tying her to this woman in a way that felt fated. Shadow's journey to her cabin, a thread in a tapestry woven decades ago. She'd invited Esther to stay, the cabin's spare room now hers, and the elderly woman had accepted, her eyes bright with gratitude, saying, "This place feels like home already." Her words echoing Lila's own sense of belonging. They'd settled into a rhythm, Lila cooking simple meals, Esther sharing stories of Pinarest's past, Shadow dividing his time between them, his tail wagging as he sensed their growing bond, the cabin alive with laughter and quiet moments that soothed Lila's scars, her nightmares fading, replaced by dreams of mountains and green eyes. The land deed's proceeds, secured through a lease to an environmentally conscious company, promised wealth neither woman needed, and they agreed to funnel most of it to veterans' charities and animal rescues, honoring the soldiers and creatures who'd shaped their lives, a decision that felt right, like closing a circle. Lila had begun renovating the cabin, fixing the roof, adding a ramp for Esther's mobility, each hammer strike a step toward permanence, a commitment to this unexpected family forged by survival. One evening, as spring's first thaw painted the pines in soft greens. They sat on the porch, shadow sprawled between them, and Esther held a photograph from the shed Lila had found weeks ago, her grandfather and Esther as children, smiling in a meadow, the valley's promise in their young eyes. "He'd be proud of you," Esther said, her voice soft, and Lila felt a lump in her throat, realizing her grandfather's stories of Pinarest had led her here, to this moment, to this woman who'd loved him as a friend. Shadow's journey, his impossible choice of Lila's cabin, felt like more than chance, and Esther mused, maybe he was sent to bring us together. Her words stirring Lila's practical mind, yet she couldn't deny the weight of coincidence, the way their paths had converged. Lila's military scars, once a barrier, now felt like a bridge, connecting her to Esther's resilience, Shadow's courage, and a family history she'd never known, her isolation replaced by a warmth she hadn't thought possible. She reached down, stroking Shadow's fur, and said, "Whatever brought us here, I'm grateful." Her voice steady, the truth settling deep, her heart lighter than it had been since Afghanistan. Esther nodded, her hand joining Lila's on Shadow's head, and they sat in silence, the mountains stretching before them, no longer a wall, but a horizon of possibility. The cabin a testament to second chances, to healing through connection, to a dog who'd found them when they needed each other most. Lila slept that night without nightmares, Shadow at her bedside, his presence a quiet promise, and in Esther's room, a photograph of the valley rested on the nightstand, a symbol of a promise kept across decades, their unlikely family bound by love, loss, and the green-eyed Malamute who'd changed everything.